Let us place you very carefully into the body of an ordinary Roman citizen in approximately the year 120 AD during the reign of the Emperor Hadrian. You are not a senator. You are not a wealthy merchant with a private villa on the Palatine Hill. You are a common person, a shopkeeper perhaps, or a minor clerk in one of the countless government offices that kept the machinery of the empire turning. You live in an insula, a multi-story apartment building in one of the crowded neighborhoods on the eastern side of the city. The first thing you would notice upon waking is the noise. Rome never truly slept. The heavy wagons that were banned from the streets during daylight hours by an edict of Julius Caesar that was still enforced 160 years later had been rumbling through the narrow lanes all night, delivering grain, wine, marble, timber, and 1,000 other commodities to the warehouses and shops of the city. The sound of iron-rimmed wheels on stone paving was a deep, continuous grinding. Ga, clack, ga, clack. It came through the thin walls of the insula like the breathing of a very large, very restless animal. The second thing you would notice is the smell. Your apartment is on the 4th floor. The higher the floor, the cheaper the rent, because the higher floors had no running water, no sanitation, and the greatest risk of collapse or fire. The stairwell smells of stale cooking oil, human urine, and the faint, sweet, nauseating scent of the communal latrine on the ground floor, which has not been cleaned in several days. Your room itself smells of the woolen blanket you slept under, which has not been washed in weeks, and of the clay chamber pot in the corner, which you used during the night, because the latrine was 4 flights of stairs away, and the streets were dark and dangerous. The chamber pot is your first hygiene decision of the day, and it is a decision that reveals the fundamental difference between Roman hygiene and modern hygiene. In Rome, the disposal of human waste was not a private, invisible, flush-and-forget process. It was a physical, manual, unavoidable part of daily life. The chamber pot, the lasanum in Latin, was a wide-mouthed ceramic vessel, approximately the size and shape of a modern mixing bowl. It sat in the corner of the room, uncovered, and its contents were your responsibility. You could carry it down 4 flights of stairs and empty it into the cesspit beneath the communal latrine. You could pour it into the gutter outside the building, where it would join the general flow of waste that trickled down the center of the street toward the nearest drain. Or, and this was technically illegal, but universally practiced, you could simply open your window and throw the contents into the street below. The Roman poet Juvenal wrote of the dangers of walking the streets of Rome at night, when the contents of chamber pots rained from the upper windows without warning. The sound of a chamber pot being emptied from a 4th floor window was a distinctive, liquid sploosh, followed by the sharp clatter of ceramic on stone if the pot itself was dropped. Pedestrians learned to walk close to the walls of buildings and to listen for the warning shout, "Aqua," that a considerate tenant might give before emptying the pot. An inconsiderate tenant gave no warning at all. You carry your chamber pot down the stairs. Each step is worn smooth by centuries of feet, and the stairwell is dark, lit only by a small oil lamp on each landing that gives off a feeble, flickering light and a thin trail of greasy smoke. The pot is heavy and warm. You hold it carefully because spilling it on the stairs would not only be unpleasant for you, but would earn you the fury of every tenant on the floors below. You reach the ground floor and tip the contents of the pot into the cesspit, a stone-lined hole beneath the latrine that is emptied periodically by the stercorarii, the dung collectors, who came in the night with their carts and their shovels and their apparently complete immunity to the smell. The cesspit makes a thick gurgling sound as it receives your contribution. Glub, glub. You rinse the pot with a splash of water from the communal fountain in the courtyard. Splash. The water runs cloudy for a moment, then clear. You climb back up the stairs. Your morning hygiene routine has begun. Back in your room, you wash your face. The water comes from a clay jug that you filled at the public fountain the previous evening. The fountain, one of the hundreds that dot the city, fed by the great aqueducts, provides clean, cold water that flows continuously day and night in a musical, splashing stream that is one of the defining sounds of Rome. You pour water into a shallow bronze basin and splash it on your face. The water is cold. There is no way to heat it in your room, which has no fireplace and no kitchen. And it hits your skin with a sharp, bracing shock that makes you gasp. You rub your face vigorously with your hands, scrubbing the sleep from your eyes and the grime of the night from your skin. There is no soap. Soap, in the modern sense, does not exist in Rome. The Romans are aware of soap. They know that the Germanic tribes to the north use a substance made from animal fat and wood ash to wash their hair, but they consider it a barbarian novelty, unsuitable for civilized people. Instead of soap, you use a mixture of pumice powder and olive oil. You sprinkle a pinch of the fine gray pumice powder into your palm. Add a few drops of olive oil from a small clay flask and rub your hands together until the mixture forms a thin, gritty paste. You apply this paste to your face and rub it in circular motions. The pumice acts as an abrasive, scouring away the dead skin and the surface dirt. The olive oil acts as a moisturizer, leaving the skin slightly oily but clean. The sensation is of having your face gently sandpapered, not unpleasant, but not exactly luxurious either. Your teeth are cleaned with a dentifricium, a tooth powder made from crushed bone, crushed oyster shell, and powdered pumice mixed with a small amount of salt and sometimes flavored with mint or myrrh. You dip a frayed twig, the Roman equivalent of a toothbrush, into the powder and rub it vigorously across your teeth and gums. The powder is gritty and slightly salty, and it makes a soft scratching sound against the enamel. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It is effective in a brutal, abrasive sort of way. Roman dental hygiene was, by the standards of the ancient world, remarkably good, and many Romans retained most of their teeth into old age. One more detail about Roman dental care that you almost certainly do not want to know. The most highly valued mouthwash in Rome was human urine, specifically imported Portuguese urine, which was considered to be of superior quality. The ammonia in the urine acted as a bleaching agent, whitening the teeth and killing bacteria. The taste was exactly what you would imagine. The Romans, who were in many ways extraordinarily sophisticated, saw nothing unusual in rinsing their mouths with a substance that the modern person would not use to clean a floor. One of the most striking differences between Roman hygiene and modern hygiene was the Roman attitude toward the toilet. In the modern world, the toilet is a private space, a room with a lock on the door designed for solitary use. In Rome, the toilet was a public space, a large open room where dozens of people sat side by side, conducting their most intimate business in full view of their neighbors. The public latrine, the forica, was typically a long rectangular room with a stone bench running along 3 or 4 walls. The bench had a series of keyhole-shaped holes cut into its surface, spaced approximately 18 inches apart. Beneath the bench, a channel of running water carried the waste away to the nearest sewer. Above the bench, there was usually no partition, no divider, and no privacy whatsoever. You would enter the latrine through a doorway. Some latrines charged a small admission fee, collected by an attendant who sat at the entrance with a wooden box of coins. And you would take your seat on the bench, your toga or tunic gathered around your waist, your bare backside resting on the cold stone. On either side of you, other Romans were doing exactly the same thing. You might know them. They might be your neighbors, your colleagues, your clients, or your social superiors. It made no difference. The latrine was the great equalizer. The sound of the public latrine was a symphony of human biology. The running water beneath the bench made a constant rushing sound. Shh. The stone chamber amplified every other sound, the clearing of throats, the shuffling of sandaled feet, the occasional unavoidable sounds of digestive function that echoed off the marble walls with an embarrassing clarity. The Romans, who were considerably less squeamish about these things than we are, talked through it all. The latrine was a place of conversation, gossip, business deals, and social networking. The single most frequently cited fact about Roman hygiene, the fact that appears in every documentary, every textbook, and every online article about life in ancient Rome, is the tossorium, or the sponge on a stick. This was the Roman equivalent of toilet paper, and it was exactly what it sounds like: a natural sea sponge attached to the end of a wooden stick used for cleaning after using the latrine. The tossorium was kept in a bucket of salt water or vinegar that sat beside the bench. When you had finished your business, you reached into the bucket, retrieved the sponge, and used it. The sponge was soft, absorbent, and, when freshly cleaned, reasonably hygienic. The salt water or vinegar acted as a mild disinfectant, killing some of the bacteria that accumulated on the sponge between uses. The oil left the skin smooth and supple, and the removal of the dead cells gave it a fresh, slightly glowing quality that the Romans considered the hallmark of a clean, well-maintained body. The gloios itself, the scraped-off mixture of oil, sweat, and dirt, was not discarded. It was collected in a small jar and sold. The gloios from the bodies of famous athletes was particularly valuable, believed to have medicinal properties that could cure inflammations, ease joint pain, and heal bruises. Jars of athletes' gloios were sold outside the palaestra at prices that would make a modern pharmacist blush. The buyers rubbed it into their own skin, their wounds, and their aching muscles, in the sincere belief that the bodily residue of a champion wrestler contained a healing power that transcended its ingredients. After the strigiling was complete, the body was rinsed with warm water, either by pouring it from a jug or by immersing in one of the pools. The water ran over the clean skin in a smooth, unbroken sheet, carrying away the last traces of oil and leaving the body feeling light, warm, and profoundly clean. A second application of olive oil followed, a thinner coat this time, applied by hand, rubbed gently into the skin to moisturize and protect it. This oil was often scented with perfume: rose, lavender, saffron, or cinnamon, depending on the bather's taste and budget. The scented oil left a faint, pleasant fragrance that clung to the skin for hours, the Roman equivalent of aftershave or cologne. The entire process, exercise, oil, scrape, rinse, re-oil, was the Roman body cleaning ritual. It did not involve soap, it did not involve scrubbing with a cloth, and it did not involve the large quantities of hot water that a modern shower consumes. But it was effective. The strigil removed the dirt, the oil moisturized the skin, and the perfume provided the social function of pleasant body odor. A well-strigiled Roman was, by any reasonable standard, a clean human being. The Roman bathhouse was organized around 3 principal rooms, each maintained at a different temperature. The sequence was designed to move the bather gradually from one temperature extreme to another, opening the pores, inducing perspiration, and finally closing the pores again with a shock of cold water. The frigidarium was the cold room. It contained a large plunge pool of cold water, fed directly from the aqueduct, unheated, and approximately the temperature of a mountain stream. Entering the frigidarium pool was not a gentle experience. It was a shock, a full-body, breath-stealing, involuntary, gasp-inducing shock that hit the skin like a slap and made the heart pound with sudden, fierce vitality. Splash! You stepped into the pool. The water hit your feet first, cold, shockingly cold, and then your calves, your thighs, your waist, and finally, with a deep breath and a clenching of every muscle, your chest and shoulders. The cold water pressed against your skin like a tight, icy glove. Your breathing accelerated. Your skin erupted in goosebumps. Your blood retreated from the surface and rushed toward your core, leaving your fingers and toes tingling and numb. You stayed in the cold pool for a short time, perhaps 2 or 3 minutes. The sound of the frigidarium was of splashing water and involuntary gasps. Splash! Ha! Splash! Ooh! The bathers entered and exited quickly, their faces flushed, their skin a vivid, startling pink that contrasted sharply with the white marble of the pool surround. From the frigidarium, you moved to the tepidarium, the warm room. The temperature here was moderate, approximately 80 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Warm enough to be comfortable, but not so hot as to induce heavy sweating. The tepidarium served as a transitional space, allowing the body to adjust gradually to the increasing heat. The tepidarium was the social heart of the bathhouse. It was a large, high-ceilinged room with a vaulted roof and walls of polished marble that reflected the light of dozens of oil lamps. The air was warm and slightly humid, carrying the mingled scents of olive oil, perfume, and the mineral tang of the heated water. The floor was heated from below by the hypocaust, a system of channels beneath the floor through which hot air from the furnace circulated, warming the marble above to a temperature that was pleasant to bare feet. The sound of the tepidarium was a low, comfortable hum of conversation. Men sat on the warm marble benches, their bodies relaxed, their voices soft and easy. The echoing acoustics of the vaulted ceiling turned every conversation into a murmur, every laugh into a resonant, rolling chuckle, and every footstep into a gentle padding tap. It was a sound that invited relaxation, that slowed the heartbeat and softened the muscles, that made the eyes heavy and the mind drift. This was where the strigiling took place, in the warm, comfortable air of the tepidarium. This was where the oil was applied, the body scraped, the skin rinsed, and re-oiled. The attendants moved quietly among the bathers, their strigils flashing in the lamplight, their hands working with the practiced, rhythmic efficiency of people who performed the same task hundreds of times a day. Shh, shh, shh. The sound blended with the conversation and the distant splashing of water, creating a layered, deeply soporific acoustic environment. The final room was the caldarium, the hot room. This was the Roman equivalent of a sauna or a steam room, and it was maintained at temperatures that would make a modern health inspector nervous. The air temperature in the caldarium could reach 120 degrees Fahrenheit or more, and the water in the hot pool was heated to a temperature that was just short of painful. Entering the caldarium was like walking into a wall of heat. The air hit your lungs with a heavy, pressing warmth that made breathing feel like a conscious effort. The marble floor was so hot that wooden sandals, sculpini, had to be worn to prevent burns. The walls were sweating, beaded with condensation that trickled down the marble in slow, glistening rivulets. The steam rose from the hot pool in lazy, curling clouds that hung in the air like motionless fog. You lowered yourself into the hot pool. The water was almost unbearably warm, hot enough to make your skin flush crimson within seconds, hot enough to make your heart race and your pores open wide. The heat penetrated deep into the muscles, loosening the tension of the day's labor, softening the knots and the aches that had accumulated in the shoulders and the lower back. The sensation was of being slowly, thoroughly, almost aggressively relaxed. A forced surrender of muscular tension that left you feeling limp, heavy, and profoundly at peace. The sound of the caldarium was dominated by the water, the soft lapping of the pool against its marble edges, the steady drip, drip, drip of condensation falling from the ceiling, and the occasional splash of a bather entering or leaving the pool. The voices were quieter here. The heat discouraged vigorous conversation, and the overall effect was of a warm, wet, hushed cocoon that insulated the bather from the noise and the bustle of the city outside. You might stay in the caldarium for 20 minutes, or 30, or an hour, depending on your tolerance for heat and your schedule for the day. When you finally emerged, your skin flushed, your body sweating, your muscles as soft as cooked noodles, you would return to the frigidarium for a final cold plunge that would close the pores, tighten the skin, and leave you feeling astonishingly, vibrantly, almost electrically alive. Hair care in ancient Rome was an elaborate, time-consuming, and occasionally painful business. The Roman barber, the tonsor, was a fixture of the urban landscape, operating from small shops that opened directly onto the street. The shops were simple: a chair, a mirror of polished bronze, a set of iron scissors, a razor of sharpened steel or obsidian, and a collection of combs, tweezers, and the curling irons. The Roman razor was a formidable tool. It had no safety guard, no pivoting head, and no ergonomic handle. It was a flat blade of iron or steel honed to a thin, keen edge on a whetstone, and it was sharpened before each use with a rhythmic, rasping sound. Shh. The tonsor held the razor at a precise angle against the skin and drew it downward in short, careful strokes, removing the stubble with a soft, scraping whisper. Rush, rush, rush. There was no shaving cream, no shaving foam, no hot towel. The face was sometimes moistened with water or oiled with a thin layer of olive oil, but many barbers shaved their customers dry. The experience was, by modern standards, somewhere between uncomfortable and excruciating. The iron razors of 120 AD were not as sharp as a modern steel razor, and they tended to pull at the hairs rather than cut them cleanly. Nicks, cuts, and razor burns were common. So common that the tonsure kept a supply of spiderweb bandages and astringent powders to staunch the bleeding. The Roman writer Martial complained bitterly about his barber, claiming that the scars on his chin were so numerous that they resembled a map of the provinces. The experience of being shaved in a Roman barbershop was, for many men, a daily endurance test that combined the intimacy of a medical procedure with the discomfort of minor surgery. The Romans had a complicated relationship with body hair. The ideal Roman body, male and female, was smooth. Excessive body hair was considered a sign of rusticity, of uncivilized origins, of a person who was closer to the animal kingdom than to the refined world of the toga and the forum. Many Romans, particularly the wealthy and the fashionable, went to great lengths to remove their body hair. The methods available were limited and uniformly unpleasant. The most common was plucking, using a pair of bronze tweezers called valsella to pull each hair out individually. This was done either by the individual or by a slave, and it was performed in the bath, where the warm water and the steam opened the pores and made the hairs slightly easier to extract. The sound of plucking was a tiny, sharp tick, barely audible, but felt intensely by the person being plucked. Tick, wince, tick, wince, tick. The process was slow, painful, and apparently endless. A complete depilation of the chest, the armpits, and the legs could take several hours, during which time the slave worked with the steady, mechanical persistence of a person who had been performing the same task every day for years. An alternative to plucking was the use of a depilatory paste, a mixture of resin, pitch, and sometimes arsenic that was spread on the skin, allowed to dry, and then ripped off in strips, taking the hair with it. This was the Roman equivalent of waxing, and it was exactly as painful as it sounds. The paste was heated until it was warm and pliable, spread on the skin with a wooden spatula, schlop, pressed firmly into the hair, and then, after a moment's terrified anticipation, yanked off in a single, decisive motion. Rah, rip. The sound was followed by a sharp intake of breath, and sometimes by a word that we shall not reproduce here. The third option was a drop axe, a chemical depilatory made from a mixture of resin, goat's bile, bat's blood, and powdered viper. The effectiveness of this mixture was questionable, but its unpleasantness was not. It was applied to the skin as a paste, left for a specified period, and then scraped off with a strigil. Whether it actually removed the hair or merely punished the wearer for having it is a matter of some historical debate. If the Roman approach to body cleaning was oil-based, the Roman approach to laundry was, there is no gentle way to say this, urine-based. The laundering of clothes in ancient Rome was performed by professional launderers called fulones, who operated workshops known as fulonicae. These workshops were among the smelliest establishments in the city, and they were located, for good reason, in the industrial districts on the outskirts of the residential neighborhoods. The primary cleaning agent used by the fulons was aged human urine. Urine was collected from the public latrines and from large ceramic jars, dolia curta, that were placed on street corners specifically for the purpose. Passers-by were encouraged to use these jars, and many did, contributing their urine to the city's laundry supply with a casualness that would astound the modern pedestrian. The urine was not used fresh. It was stored in large vats and allowed to age for several weeks, during which time the urea in the urine decomposed into ammonia. It was the ammonia that did the actual cleaning, dissolving the grease and the dirt that accumulated in the woolen fibers of the Roman toga, breaking down the organic stains and leaving the fabric chemically clean, if not exactly fragrant. The laundering process itself was brutally physical. The clothes were placed in a large stone tub, the saltus phallonicus, and soaked in the aged urine. Then a worker stepped into the tub and began to tread the clothes with his bare feet. Squish, 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 squish. The sound of the fuller treading the clothes was a heavy, rhythmic, squelching beat that could be heard from the street outside. The worker held the edges of the tub for balance and stamped his feet up and down, kneading the fabric against the stone bottom of the tub with his toes and his heels. The ammonia in the urine penetrated the fibers, dissolving the dirt and the natural oils of the wool, while the mechanical action of the treading worked the cleaning agent deep into the fabric. The treading continued for a considerable time, perhaps 30 minutes for a single load of garments. The worker's feet and legs, from the ankle to the knee, were immersed in the urine solution throughout. The smell was, by all accounts, overwhelming. A thick, acrid, eye-watering reek of ammonia that permeated the worker's skin and his clothing and followed him home at the end of the day. After the treading, the clothes were rinsed in clean water, wrung out by hand, and spread on frames to dry in the sun. The dried clothes were then brushed with a comb made of dried hedgehog skins, the spines acting as a natural carding tool that raised the nap of the wool and gave it a soft, fluffy texture. The final step was sulfuring. The clothes were hung over a frame above a pot of burning sulfur, and the sulfur fumes bleached the wool to a brilliant, almost luminous white. The result was a toga that was clean, white, and socially acceptable. The process that produced it, involving urine, bare feet, hedgehog skins, and sulfur fumes, was something that the toga's wearer preferred not to think about. The fulons occupied a low rung on the Roman social ladder, respected for the necessity of their trade, but avoided for the smell that accompanied it. So important was urine to the Roman laundry industry that the Emperor Vespasian, who reigned from 69 to 79 AD, imposed a tax on the collection of urine from the public latrines. When his son Titus complained that the tax was undignified, Vespasian held a coin beneath his son's nose and asked whether it smelled. Titus admitted that it did not. "And yet," said Vespasian, "it comes from urine." The phrase pecunia non olet, money does not smell, became one of the most famous sayings of the Roman world, and public urinals in several European languages are still called Vespasians in his honor. None of the Roman hygiene systems, not the baths, not the latrines, not the sewers, not the laundries, could have functioned without the aqueducts. The aqueducts were the single most important piece of infrastructure in the Roman world, and they were, by any standard, one of the greatest engineering achievements of human civilization. By the year 120 AD, Rome was served by 11 aqueducts, which together delivered approximately 250 million gallons of fresh water to the city every day. 250 million gallons per day. For a city of approximately 1 million people, that was roughly 250 gallons per person per day. a figure that is comparable to, and in some cases exceeds, the per capita water consumption of a modern American city. The water came from springs in the hills surrounding Rome, some of them more than 50 miles from the city. It flowed by gravity alone. The aqueducts were angled at a precise gradient, typically about 1 foot of drop for every 200 feet of length. Through a system of channels, tunnels, and elevated stone bridges that carried the water across valleys and over hills with a gentle, continuous, never-ceasing flow. The sound of the aqueduct water entering the city was one of the defining sounds of Rome. At the terminal points, the castella or distribution tanks, the water cascaded into large stone basins with a rushing, splashing musical sound that could be heard from a considerable distance. From the castella, the water was distributed through a network of lead and ceramic pipes to the public fountains, the bathhouses, the latrines, and the private homes of the wealthy. The public fountains were the primary source of water for the ordinary Roman citizen. There were approximately 1,300 fountains in Rome, roughly one for every 800 residents, and they flowed continuously, 24 hours a day, fed by the inexhaustible supply of the aqueducts. The sound of a Roman fountain was a constant, splashing, gurgling musical sound that formed the background of life in every neighborhood. Splash, 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 splash. The water fell from a spout, usually a carved stone head of a lion or a deity, into a shallow stone basin, overflowed the basin, and ran into a channel that carried it to the nearest drain and eventually to the sewer. The overflow was deliberate. It flushed the streets, washed away the refuse, and kept the drains flowing. You would visit the fountain every day carrying a clay or wooden jug. You would hold the jug beneath the spout and wait as it filled. Glug, 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 glug. The water was cold, clean, and by the standards of the ancient world, remarkably pure. The aqueducts carried it from mountain springs through closed channels that protected it from contamination, and the water that emerged from the fountain in your neighborhood had traveled 50 miles without being touched by a human hand. The fountain was also a social gathering point. Women came to fill their jugs in the morning and the evening, and the fountain became a place of conversation, gossip, and the exchange of news. The sound of women's voices, mixed with the splashing of the fountain, was part of the daily rhythm of the Roman neighborhood, a familiar, comforting sound that signaled the passage of the ordinary hours of the ordinary day. There is a persistent modern theory that the Roman Empire fell because of lead poisoning caused by the lead pipes that carried water from the aqueducts to the homes and the public buildings. This theory is almost certainly overstated. While the Romans did use lead pipes extensively, the Latin word for lead is plumbum, from which we derive the English word plumbing. The continuous flow of water through the pipes prevented the significant accumulation of lead in the water supply. The calcium deposits that built up on the inside of the pipes over time also created a natural barrier between the water and the lead. This is not to say that the Romans were not exposed to lead. They were, through their cookware, their cosmetics, their wine, and 100 other sources. But the water supply, despite the lead pipes, remained relatively safe. The Roman who drank from the public fountain was consuming water that was, in many respects, cleaner than the water available in most European cities until the 19th century. The Roman obsession with cleanliness was matched by an equally intense obsession with pleasant odor. In a city of 1 million people, with limited sanitation, open sewers, animal markets, tanneries, fulonicae, and the general pervasive smell of human habitation in a Mediterranean climate, the desire to smell good was not merely vanity, it was self-defense. Perfume was used by virtually everyone in Rome, from the wealthiest patrician to the most modest freedwoman. The perfumes were oil-based, essential oils extracted from flowers, herbs, and spices, dissolved in a carrier of olive oil or almond oil. The most popular scents were rose, saffron, cinnamon, nard, a plant related to valerian, and myrrh. The perfumes were stored in small glass or alabaster bottles, and they were applied to the skin, the hair, and the clothing at multiple points throughout the day. The application of perfume was a sensory ritual. The bottle was uncorked with a soft pop. The oil was tipped onto the fingertips, a single golden drop that caught the light. The fingertips were pressed to the pulse points, the wrists, the neck, behind the ears. The oil warmed against the skin, releasing its fragrance in a slow, unfurling bloom of scent that mixed with the body's own warmth to create a personal, intimate aroma that was as individual as a fingerprint. The wealthier Romans perfumed not only themselves, but their surroundings. Perfume was added to the oil lamps that lit the dining room, so that the light itself carried a scent. Dried rose petals were scattered on the floor, releasing their fragrance when crushed underfoot. Incense was burned on small bronze altars, filling the room with the heavy resinous smoke of frankincense and myrrh. The Roman dinner party was an assault on the senses, a layered, complex experience of taste, sight, sound, and smell that was designed to overwhelm and to impress. Roman women, and to a lesser extent, Roman men, used a range of cosmetics that were, by modern standards, both inventive and alarming. The foundation of the Roman complexion was cerussa, white lead powder mixed with animal fat or olive oil into a smooth, pale paste that was applied to the face and the neck. The result was a ghostly, porcelain white complexion that was considered the height of beauty and fashion. The white lead was, of course, toxic. Prolonged use caused skin damage, hair loss, and a host of neurological symptoms that the Romans attributed to the will of the gods, rather than to the cosmetics on their faces. But the fashion persisted for centuries because the alternative, a sun-tanned complexion, was associated with outdoor labor and, by extension, with the lower classes. The eyes were lined with kohl, a dark powder made from antimony or soot, applied to the upper and lower eyelids with a thin pointed stick. The lips were colored with a paste of red ochre or crushed mulberries. The cheeks were rouged with a mixture of red lead, cinnabar, or rose petals ground in fat. The nails were painted with a mixture of animal fat and blood. The application of these cosmetics was a morning ritual that could take an hour or more. The Roman lady sat before her polished bronze mirror while her slave applied each product in a precise, practiced sequence. The white lead first, spread in a thin, even layer across the face. Then the kohl, drawn along the eyelids in a steady, careful line. Then the rouge, dabbed onto the cheeks and blended with the fingertips. Then the lip color, applied with a small brush of camel hair. The result was a face that was artificial, stylized, and, to the Roman eye, beautiful. What did Rome smell like? The honest answer is complicated. It smelled of perfume and of sewage, of roasting meat and of rotting garbage, of incense and of urine, of fresh bread and of horse dung, of flowers and of tanneries, of the clean mineral scent of aqueduct water and the thick organic reek of the Tiber River on a warm afternoon. The smell was layered, the way the sounds of the city were layered. Walking down a Roman street, your nose would encounter a constantly shifting sequence of odors: the sweet, smoky scent of a bakery, the sharp ammonia tang of a Fullonica, the rich, oily smell of a perfume shop, the heavy animal smell of a butcher's stall, the clean, slightly chalky scent of a marble cutter's workshop. Each doorway was a different world, each street corner a different olfactory experience. The Romans were aware of the smells of their city, and they made deliberate efforts to manage them. The sewers carried away the worst of the waste. The fountains flushed the streets. The incense and the perfume masked the body odors and the domestic smells. But the underlying reality, the reality of 1 million people living in close proximity, without refrigeration, without modern sanitation, without deodorant, was a smell that the modern nose would find overwhelming. And yet, the Romans did not consider their city to be particularly malodorous. They were, after all, the cleanest civilization in the ancient world. Their baths, their sewers, their aqueducts, and their latrines represented a standard of public hygiene that would not be equaled in Europe until the 19th century. If Rome smelled, it smelled less than anywhere else, and the Romans were, in their own way, proud of this fact. As the day drew to a close and the shadows lengthened across the forums and the colonnades, many Romans returned to the baths for a second visit. The evening bath was shorter than the afternoons. A quick dip in the warm pool, a brief scraping with the strigil, a rinse, and a fresh application of scented oil. It was a ritual of renewal, a washing away of the day's sweat and dust before the evening's dinner. The bathhouse in the evening was a different place from the bustling, noisy establishment of the afternoon. The crowds had thinned. The light was lower. The oil lamps cast a warm, golden glow across the marble surfaces, and the steam from the caldarium caught the light in slow, spiraling columns. The sound was softer, the gentle lapping of the pools, the murmur of quiet conversation, the distant clang of the furnace doors as the slaves added fuel to keep the water hot through the night. The evening bather moved through the rooms with a slower, more deliberate pace. There was no exercise, no wrestling, no competitive ball games. There was only the water, warm, then hot, then cold, and the slow, rhythmic scraping of the strigil, and the smooth, oily sensation of the perfumed oil being rubbed into the clean, tired skin. You returned to your insula, climbing the worn stone steps in the fading light. Your skin was clean, oiled, and faintly scented with rose or cinnamon. Your toga, collected from the fuller that morning, bleached white with sulfur and hedgehog spines, hung in crisp folds around your body. Your teeth had been cleaned with bone powder and frayed twig. Your face had been scraped by the tonsur's razor. Your body had been strigiled, rinsed, heated, cooled, and oiled. You were, by the standards of 120 AD, immaculately clean. Cleaner, in fact, than most Europeans would be for the next 1700 years, until the rediscovery of public hygiene in the Victorian era. The Roman system of aqueducts, baths, sewers, and latrines represented a standard of urban cleanliness that was both extraordinary for its time and remarkably effective by any measure. But the system had its contradictions. the shared sponge in the latrine, the lead in the cosmetics, the urine in the laundry, the parasites that thrived in the warm water of the bathhouse pools, which were rarely drained and never chlorinated, the open cesspit beneath the ground floor latrine, breeding flies and disease within feet of the living quarters. The Romans were clean on the surface, but the invisible world of bacteria and parasites, a world they did not know existed, flourished in the very systems they had built to promote health. You lay on your sleeping platform in the darkness of the fourth floor. The wool blanket was scratchy against your clean skin. The oil lamp on the small table beside you gave off a thin, flickering light and a faint wisp of smoke that curled toward the ceiling. The sounds of Rome filtered through the thin walls, the grinding of cartwheels on stone, the shout of a night watchman, the distant drunken singing of someone returning from a dinner party, and always, always the sound of water, the fountains flowing, the aqueducts delivering, the sewers carrying away. The sound of water was the heartbeat of Rome. It was the sound of an engineering civilization that had conquered the problem of distance, that had reached into the mountains and brought clean water to a city of 1 million people through channels of stone and lead that stretched for hundreds of miles. It was the sound of a city that took hygiene seriously, that built public baths the size of palaces and public latrines the size of banquet halls, that taxed urine and sold sweat and scraped its citizens clean with curved metal blades. The water flowed, the fountains splashed, the sewers murmured beneath the streets. The bathhouse furnaces glowed in the darkness, keeping the water warm for the first bathers of the morning, who would arrive at dawn and begin the whole magnificent, repulsive, ingenious, contradictory cycle of Roman hygiene all over again. Your oil lamp guttered. The flame shrank to a tiny blue point, trembled once, and went out. The darkness was total. The sounds of the city continued, the water, the carts, the distant voices, but they were growing softer now, fading into the general murmur of a city settling into sleep. You pulled the blanket to your chin. Your skin was smooth and clean. Your muscles were soft from the bath. The scent of rose oil lingered on your wrists. The sound of the fountain in the courtyard below, splash, 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 was the last thing you heard. As your breathing slowed, your eyes closed, and the long, slow, boring, magnificent story of hygiene in ancient Rome came to its gentle, unhurried, and perfectly soporific end.